About 3 years ago, I began a short series of conversions where I reimagined how Call would have used traitor geneseed to construct new Primaris chapters. There have been a few hints in the lore that this has already been done, and so, following along with this line of thought, I decided to give Primaris Refying some World Eaters a go. But, to avoid any suspicion, I'll be giving them their original Legion name. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to kitbash some Primaris War Hounds. The War Hounds already had an affinity for close combat, even before Angron took over, so it makes sense that their geneseed carries this innate desire for intimate carnage. As such, I decided to choose the Assault Intercessor sprue as my starting point. I first removed the parts required to build the legs and torso before trimming away any mold lines. In a fairly predictable manner for me, I then proceeded to remove the Aquila from the chest. I personally prefer a more simplified armor design, and this also allows me to easily add any extra components or markings later on. To remove the Aquila, I carefully use my scalpel to shave away small chunks of the plastic until most of the design had been removed. I then held my scalpel more perpendicular to the surface and adopted a scraping action to smooth the chest armor flat. Another feature that I'm a fan of are molecular bonding studs on Power Armour. I find these rivets help to create a more archaic aspect to the otherwise clean and modern Mark X Power Armour. Adding them is fairly simple too. I started by drawing a series of guidelines onto the greaves, and then into these I drilled a series of evenly spaced holes. These were roughly 0.5 mm deep and created with a 1 mm drill bit. The size of hole allowed me to superglue some 1 mm diameter steel ball bearings into them, and by only drilling a shallow hole, the ball would appear as a raised half sphere on the surface, mimicking the appearance of a rivet. This was repeated across all of the drilled holes until I was left with the following. Now, I have already covered this process in more detail in another video, so if you're interested in how these could be attached to shoulder pads too, I'll include a link above and below to that guide. You will notice that I made the adjustments to the chest and the leg while the components were separated. This is generally the best time to make cuts and tweaks to parts, because after assembly you're more likely to have other parts get in the way or damage them during the adjustment process. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but where possible, try to plan out your conversion so your cuts, trims and drilling all occur before assembly. When it came to arming my Warhound, I would obviously be leaning towards axe-based weaponry, something synonymous with the World Eaters both before and after the Horus Heresy, but I decided against using chain axes. These still felt too closely linked to Chaos Space Marines, so I instead opted for a regular power axe, which was taken from the Space Marine Devastator kit. Alongside this, I also grabbed the Power Hammer carrying arm from the Assault Intercessors, which will provide the Primaris scaled arm and hilt. The modifications began with the cutting away of the wire on the hammerhead with my knife. Once removed, the top of the handle was then trimmed flat. I also took this opportunity to make room for a later modification. In much the same way that I removed the Aquila, I also removed the small skull from the vambrace. The axe head was then removed from its handle, just below where the wire loops back into the handle. The cut was also trimmed flat to make attaching it to the handle much easier, and I've said handle far too many times there. However, even with this flattening out, the contact points between the handle and the axe were far too small to create a sturdy bond. To get around this, I used my pin vise to drill 2 holes a few millimeters into both the axe head and the hammer's handle. Into the hole in the handle, I superglued some 1 mm thick wire, gave it a chance to dry, and then clipped the rest of the wire away so it was only left with a few millimeters protruding from the top. This was just enough to allow me to attach the axe head to the handle with more superglue to create a much sturdier bond. Before I was done with the arm though, I wanted to add a little more detail to it. Even before they fell to chaos, the World Eaters sported chains, both physically and in their armor markings. These represented Angron's origins as a gladiator slave, and even though my Primaris War Hounds wouldn't have the same origins, I like this particular motif. Additionally, I thought that it would work well with the chapter's hound aspect. With my chain picked out, I added some superglue to the vambrace and began to wrap the chain around it. Once I was happy with the amount of chain that had been added, I clipped the remaining length away. Finally, as the chain was still a little loose, which would make painting more difficult, more glue was carefully added across it. After leaving the glue to dry, the axe arm and regular assault intercessor pistol were then glued to the torso. With the arms in place, I could think about some shoulder pads, but instead of using some from another Space Marine kit, I chose to grab some components from Liber Demonica. These particular resin conversion parts are what inspired me to build this conversion. These are the Hound type shoulder pads and helmets, which have this Roman gladiator styling to them, whilst also incorporating dog motifs as well. I'll include the links to these in the description below. Once I picked out a couple of the shoulder pads from the set, I then attached these to the arms with superglue. As they are resin, regular plastic glue simply wouldn't have worked here. Now that I had the shoulder pads in position, I began attaching another chain. This was slightly chunkier than the one used around the forearm and would be draped across the torso. I started with some superglue. This was added to the Marine's upper left torso and one end of the chain was placed into it. After it had been given a few moments to dry, I wrapped the chain around the torso, avoiding the power pack contact point and then all the way up to the top of the left shoulder before being cut. I added some glue to the second contact point at the back to hold the chain in place, but much like the chain around the wrist, I needed to add yet more glue across the chain's length to prevent it from moving around. Once the glue on the chain had dried, I then continued assembly. I started with the backpack, which I'd abstained from adding earlier to make attaching that chain much easier. This was then followed up with one of the Liber Demonica heads that I'd mentioned earlier. Like the shoulder pads, this was also superglued to the torso. With all of the main body parts in place, I could then add any extra details, such as some pouches. By this stage in the build, I felt that the miniature needed something a little more relative to the name of the War Hounds. Whilst I was essentially building Loyalist World Eaters, I wanted them to still have some individualism as a chapter. The Hounds aspect was probably the easiest to represent by simply adding some fur. I could have grabbed some parts from my Space Wolf bits box, but for this I thought I'd give sculpting a go. So after I cut and rolled out a small section, I added a small amount just below the belt. To turn this green blob into something representing fur, I used a cocktail stick or toothpick dipped in some Vaseline. The point was then used to pull and scour grooves into the putty. This was much easier to do while the green stuff was still quite soft, as it allowed me to pull the fur across the leg following the movement of the model. But it's important to use something like Vaseline here, as the putty is very prone to sticking to the wood. Each of my movements followed a top to bottom motion, which helped to create the appearance of individual strands hanging down. This was repeated until I was happy with the texture. I then followed this up with a second blob of putty, placed just above the belt. As I added the fur texture and pulled this down, it created the appearance that the fur was being held in place by the belt. Finally, yet more green stuff and fur texture was added to the backpack, which helped to round out the hound theme of the chapter, and, when alongside the axe, also created a barbarian-like aspect to the model too. With the fur completed, I gave it a chance to cure fully before giving it a paint job and a base, which left me with this. And here we have my completed Warhound, my take on what Primaris World Eaters could be if their gene seed had been used. You can see that I had chosen to recreate the colours of the World Eaters rather than the inverted colours of the original Warhounds. This was more of an aesthetic decision, as I simply preferred the white with the accent of blue. The parts from Liber Demonica also really helped out here. Both the helmet and the pad feature some dog motifs, which, when combined with the fur, help to build upon that hound aspect. I'll include some links to where you can pick these up in the description below, and if you use the promo code WARGAMER, then you can get yourself a 10% discount. It was great to revisit the series and create some loyalist versions of the Traitor Legions, so if you'd like to see more of these, please do let me know in the comments below. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hurt, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Douglas Wilson, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, and Raphael Beiruthi. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use the affiliates links, then your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these different kind of conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all the relevant links, and so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.